Thank you so much for joining us. Isabelle
Thank you for
Rugol.
asking.
You are a media executive focused on building sustainable news organizations where people love to work. You now work as an independent journalist, consultant, and trainer, and you were previously international editorial director at LinkedIn, where you led the global expansion of the platform's content products and teams, which was highly multicultural. So I'm sure we're going to hear about some examples from that experience. You hold a bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri Columbia School of Journalism in the US. You've lived on 4 continents, and now you're based in London. You have experience personally working in the US, UK, Australia, Cambodia, and France, and remote management experience with India, China, Brazil, Germany, Japan. I might have forgotten some on the list.
A few more, maybe. I don't know.
My name is Tanya Ravesandratana. I'm a journalist, and in 2021, I won the Attuned Writer Fellowship, and I spent a year exploring the concept of intrinsic motivation in a Substack newsletter. This today is part of a series of webinars hosted by Attuned. If you're registered for the event, I'm guessing you're familiar with Attuned. It's a psychology-backed, AI-driven platform that shows companies what really matters to their employees by measuring and visualizing the values and intrinsic motivations that drive each person. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker, identify blind spots at a glance, and communicate more effectively. And the result is increased engagement, productivity, and innovation, more psychological safety, and ultimately happier organizations. Isabelle and I today, hi everyone, Kylo from Alberta, Canada, Michelle from Kansas in the US, part of a cross-cultural team currently, Diana in DC, Senegal, Dakar. Okay, great. We have already 3 countries represented in the chat, so feel free to let us know where you're joining.
Good mix.
So the idea for today is that Isabelle and I will discuss some of the key questions, and we have about 15 minutes at the end for your questions and comments. So feel free to type your questions into the chat at any time during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer them. If there's anything relevant that needs clarification as we go along, I will also pick up on that as we go along. So I wanted to start with a few definitions, because I think cross-cultural might mean different things to different people. So it might seem very easy to grasp when we're talking about a team made up of people who have different passports, speak different languages. And even if everybody is from the same country, speaks the same language, you also will likely have team members with different beliefs, different values, different ethnic groups, different religions. So there are lots of different components and nuances, and we're not going to be able to cover everything today. So we wanted to make clear that today Isabelle will speak from her experience living and working and managing teams across borders, just national teams so it's quite different from what we hear a lot in the HR world when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity. So Isabelle is not an expert of DIE or DEI, depending on how you use it, which is often used in a single country context, where we're going to focus on this kind of transnational, cross-cultural context. Okay. Hello from Chicago. Welcome.
Hello,
so I wanted to start with also a little bit of data to set the scene. Attuned, many people around the world have taken Attuned's intrinsic motivation assessment. And in the State of Motivation Report 2023 that Attuned's published, you will find average scores for 11 different motivators on different continents. And I thought these were quite interesting to illustrate some of the differences we can find between continents. So I've just picked 2 examples that were the most striking ones. For example, feedback, so the need for evaluation and recognition that people feel at work, had an average score of 59% in Africa compared to 42% in Australasia. And rationality, so an attraction to logical, objective methods, had an average score of 52% in South America compared to 37% in Asia. So the higher the percentage, the more important that motivator is for people on the continent. There is a lot more data like this in the State of Motivation Report 2023. I will copy the link into the chat right now in case you want to download it. And I want to start with asking you, Isabelle, about the why. Why is this important? Why should companies and organizations care about the cultural backgrounds of the people on their teams, and what happens if they don't?
Well, first, thank you for having me and for hosting this really important conversation. And thank you everyone for, joining in and listening to me ramble on. I think, why is it's kind of obvious in a way that you should care about your people feeling good at work. And it's a pretty obvious thing. And obviously, if you're managing people, if you're making people work in a way that's, completely ignorant of their values, of what makes them comfortable, of what makes them productive, of what makes them happy, you're just not going to get the best out of your people. Now you can make your life easy and be like, well, I'm just going to have a bunch of people that, are like me and that I recognize, and that, I don't need to put in as much effort to make them feel at home, because, we get each other. Obviously the problem with that is then you have an extremely not diverse team, and that just doesn't reflect the world. It doesn't reflect your customers. I think it would be really, really hard to consciously build a non-diverse team. That's just not the world that we live in. One thing I want to say is you often hear a kind of utilitarian argument for diversity, or for the need to have your employees belong, wherever they're from. And I'm always a little bit wary of utilitarian reasons and explanations, because when they tell you, oh, a more diverse team is more productive, gets you, more revenue, you're going to find just as many studies, and they're not wrong. They're going to tell you, well, diverse teams are harder to integrate, and are going to be slower to get things working. And also, if you use that utilitarian argument, then the second that someone proves you that it's not true, will you stop doing the right thing? I don't like that. So I think you should just do it because it's the right thing to do. I don't know, I don't think I'm in the minority, actually. I think everyone likes to do right, even in work, even in business, it's not a purely, profit-driven thing. It's also about doing the right thing and following your values in all the things you do in life, including work, including business. So that's the long and short answer. And also it's just a more joyful work environment when everyone belongs. And that's, who doesn't want to spend 8-10 hours a day in a joyful environment?
I was about to ask you for the practical examples of the benefits of functional cross-cultural teamwork, but you already gave some.
Oh, did I?
Feeling at home, belonging, and joy are, I think, some of the benefits that I can imagine that you've experienced personally. But if you have any other examples, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, in my experience is literally they were the only people who were able to do it. I am not going to launch an initiative in Japan run by, some white girl from France like me. It's just not going to work. I don't know the first thing about Japan. And even places that I do know, in, Germany, I took German for a gazillion years in school. I've been to Germany many times. Does that mean that I'm capable of launching a product, of understanding German consumers? No, I'm capable of leading a German team, of helping guide them, but they hold the reins because they know what they're doing. And so unless you're gonna, do business strictly for a very, very narrow set of customers who look and behave like you, you just really don't have a choice.
Okay, so better products and services, feeling belonging and joy, and just beyond all this, doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's go into the practicalities. Let's think about the first interaction between a worker and a manager and an employee, or a company and an employee at the recruitment stage. What's your advice to be thoughtful about different cultures for teams that are hiring? Any do's and don'ts in terms of writing the job description, interviewing, negotiation, etc.?
Yeah. Gosh, so many. I think I would start from the perspective of, doing right by the candidate? Like, you know, what is it that you know, as a candidate would want, or that a candidate could possibly want, and how, and that's how you build diverse teams, is by making sure that you exclude the least number of people, you know, at the beginning of the process. Because I mean, the process of hiring is a process of exclusion, right? You start with a huge group, and you know, you whittle it down to one, right? So it is one of the most exclusionary processes that you can think of, in a way. But it's making sure, and it's a bit contradictory to, like, if you want to go through hiring quickly, you know, ideally you would limit your number of candidates, you would limit, but that's how you're not going to get the diversity that you need. So making sure that you don't have exclusionary language in your job descriptions. You know, I mean, there's software now that literally will read through your description and be like, you know, watch out for this, watch out for that. Obviously, you know, making sure, you know, as much as possible that you include, I mean, if you're going to be hiring in another country, you know, that you publish in that country's language or languages, your job offer, that you include as much information as possible on things where people might self-exclude. So, you know, if you're willing to be flexible on the number of hours worked, or on the location, or a big one, immigration status, if you're able to sponsor, you know, someone, make it clear. Actually get educated on this, because there were I've heard this. I mean, I'm an immigrant. I have a lot of immigrant friends, and I've done a whole podcast about immigrant lives. And the story in work that comes again and again and again is hiring managers or even HR people saying, yeah, we're open to international candidates, because in their mind, like, yeah, sure, why not? But they have no idea actually what that entails. And I've had friends go through an entire really lengthy interview process, and only at the offer stage find out actually what they meant is, sure, if you're foreign, but you've got, you know, all the papers, well, we'll hire you. Well, of course you will, because otherwise that'd be discrimination and it's illegal. The question is, are you able to support someone through their immigration process? Are you able to sponsor them? So make all those things as clear as possible, you know, disclose salary range. I mean, in general, like, transparency and disclosure is a really big one. And so if you're gonna weed out candidates, do it on purpose. Like, you know, if your ad is going to exclude particular people, it should be because genuinely these people can't do the work. It shouldn't be by accident, because you haven't been thoughtful about what you put in that process. I remember, you know, it's also in the language that you use. I remember an ad that just, like, drove me a little crazy. It was a major American newspaper. I won't name them, and people will figure it out. And it was a major metropolitan daily, and they opened a position for a race relations correspondent. So this was around the time of, you know, like the George Floyd murder, and obviously, you know, it's a major issue in American life, and they felt that they needed someone to cover that. Great. The ad had like a whole paragraph saying, you know, we're looking for someone who's, you know, who's tough and who can take the shots, because, you know, this is a really fraught topic. You know, there is probably going to be online harassment. There's going, like, it's a hard thing to report. And so that was a very responsible thing to put in a job ad, because that's true. And people should be warned. The thing that wasn't in the job ad is what the organization was planning to do to support that employee in dealing with all that. And so it ended up with a job description that felt like it was like pushing you away. It was discouraging you from applying. And you can imagine, and that's not a cross-cultural, that's a pure DEI question, but you can imagine the kind of candidates who'll be like, yeah, sure, I'm tough, I can take it. And the kind of candidates who'll be like, oh man, can't put myself through this again, because, I mean, can't imagine a Black woman trying to do this role and having all the history of harassment that she's probably gone through already. So, those are some example. I can go on and on about this, but feel free to interrupt me at any point.
No, I think a lot of the things you mentioned are true for any kind of consideration, and not specific to cross-cultural.
Yeah.
But I think definitely being aware of visa restrictions and the kind of work that goes into this, and being aware of generally what kind of support you offer to, put your words into action, and not just be prepared to have a nice job description, but really think about it deeply.
Yeah. And what you said right here, I think is key, because you're like, well, this applies to everything. And yes, it does. And actually, I think you'll find that a lot of things in cross-cultural management is actually common sense that applies to like any kind of management or employment situation. It's just kind of heightened when you have these like really stark cultural differences. But, even within the same country, even within the same, state, city, social class, you still have differences. You still have, the people's experiences that you have to, make room for, and be aware of. So in a way, it's just like the same thing, but to the 10th or the 100th power. One something that two more things that I think matter in terms of cross-cultural and definitely like cross-country, cross-border hiring, that I think really are specific and matter. One is have someone from that country in the room on the interview panel, because so much culture shows up in interviews and even in CVs, like how you write CVs. Like, it still drives me crazy, but when I get a CV from Germany, is like that a lot. France is still like that sometimes. You get a picture on the CV, which is usually frowned upon in the Anglo world, though it still happens. You get date of birth, marital status, and number of children very often on German CVs, which as a kind of an American trained manager makes me incredibly uncomfortable, because it's information I don't want to know, because I don't want to have unconscious bias there. So there are things that you just, they might look unprofessional to you, but actually that's just a professional way that they were ought to do it in their country. So having that knowledge kind of helps you, not have an unfair bias against a particular candidate. But then just the interview process, Americans, I mean, especially if you come, I think a lot of your attendees, I think, come from the States. Americans are like very good at talking themselves up, and in ways that in other cultures would be just very braggadocious and just completely unacceptable, and just makes people genuinely uncomfortable. And so they're not going to do that in an interview. They're not going to do that down the line when it comes to promotions, when it comes to self-reviews. So having that awareness, and having someone in the interview room who can read the cues, the verbal, the body language cues of when someone has a question. They're not actually going to interject with a question. It might be a look in the eye, a way of like lowering their eyes, a way of raising their eyes, a way of just shifting in their chair that tells you, ooh, room for silence, like leave a long silence to give them time, because they're not going to jump in on their own, or interrupt you, things like that. It would just really help. So in my case, when I was launching in a new country, I didn't have anyone on my team from that country, but I would find somewhere else in the company. They weren't part of our kind of editorial, they didn't know journalism, they didn't know content, they weren't going to ask about this, but I just kind of still needed them and to kind of give me a read on that person that I couldn't get myself.
So I just to follow up on this, I imagine if you work for a big company like LinkedIn, that has this kind of rich net already internally, that is a bit easier. But if you work for a smaller organization and you don't have that at hand, I'm guessing, like, would you advise then bringing in people from externally, or just reading up on that culture beforehand? Or
I mean, reading up having a lot of it just is having the humility of questioning your own reaction to things. So, you know, someone does something that like seems rude, seems unassertive to you, like check yourself and be like, oh, wait, you know, am I translating this through my own culture? Is there maybe something else going on? And I think even having, you know, creating that space in the interview, acknowledging, hey, this is who I am, this is where I'm from. You know, if there's anything I say that you do not understand or that makes you uncomfortable or that you need clarification on, please ask. I will do the same thing for you. You know, like, like just putting it on the table, like acknowledging our, with humility, our acknowledging our own limitations. The other thing is, I'm going to say, I don't know, something that's maybe controversial, but you're not just, you have to think that you're going to be working with this person, right? And so if there is an understanding gap that is so large, like, are they the person that you can really work with on a daily basis? And particularly in a small business, you know, if you're a small company, if you're launching something abroad for the first time, the reality is like you just maybe don't have the time and the capacity to, you know, adapt to working with someone who is like so much in a different world from you. I find that I think the most valuable people, it's going to be self-serving because it's people like you and me, but I think the most valuable people on the job market are people who are able to sit between cultures. And it did end up being that a lot of the people I hired, like, you know, my India editor, like, yes, he's Indian, but he studied in Italy and in Turkey. And so he's already done that work. It's not necessarily that he's like he has been to the UK. It's not necessarily that he's like in a similar culture to me. He's already done that work of having to translate his own behavior to adapt to other culture. And I've done that work in other cultures. And so we can meet in the middle, because he has that same awareness that I have and that other people on the team have. And so it ended up that like pretty much everyone on the team was like a third culture kid, or, you know, just someone who's just very, very agile in kind of jumping those cultural borders. You know, that's not always possible. I don't know if you're going to open a factory in a really remote, you know, part of China or Brazil, you know, like maybe that's not possible. You're not going to find those people. But that's where having kind of almost cultural translators within the team is really valuable.
Okay, so you mentioned some key concepts of humility when you approach your people in the process, awareness of where you sit yourself, reaching out for resources within your own organization to relate to other cultures, and seeking out those cultural translators. I can only agree to this, obviously, but I'm a bit biased to this too. Okay, so let's imagine now we've recruited a person or people, and we have a cross-cultural team at work. What do you think that a culturally aware manager can do to set that team up for success?
So some of the things we've already discussed, definitely like acknowledging the difference and celebrating them. Like, you know, just think of where everyone comes from and what those differences are. You know, we had a little tradition on our team at LinkedIn that I loved. So we did and I'll get to that in a minute, but we did a yearly offsite where everyone got together in person, and everyone would bring candy. And we had a giant candy table, and everyone would bring like candy from their country, which is just a fun way to like illustrate just how different, you know, of a place like different people came from. Matcha green tea Kit Kat from Japan, by the way, were like, those would go, you had to grab them fast. But so, you know, acknowledging those differences. setting like a habit of communicating constantly. I mean, that's the job of management, right? You're constantly communicating, you're constantly repeating yourself and saying the same things, but it becomes all the more important. I think we'll talk later about language barriers, and then there's another layer to that. But even within the same language, constantly communicating, kind of defaulting to more low context communication. So in sort of communication science, they kind of not divide, but they rank cultures and languages on a scale from low context to high context. A high context society is one where there's a lot that's like between the lines. There's a lot that we just like culturally have in common that isn't really spoken, that you just kind of absorb through growing up in that culture, and that doesn't need explaining. And so to the outside eye, it's like, what the hell is going on here? Because like you don't have the code to translate what's happening. France, for instance, is like somewhere is this, as far as like Western cultures go, is a little bit high context, but like really high context cultures are Japan, South Korea, for instance. Low context are cultures where everything is spoken out loud and spelled out, and you just don't need to have as much of that cultural know-how to understand what's happening. America is a very low context in the United States is a very low context culture, partly because it's just full of immigrants from everywhere. So the only way you're all going to understand each other is by, speaking things out loud, because everyone comes from a different culture, whether immediately or a few generations removed. So you kind of want to default to low context, where you're going to explain more. You're not going to assume people know what you need. You're not going to assume people understand. You're not going to assume, like the way we do it in Britain, that when you say, it's okay, it actually means no, it's shit, it's terrible. Actually say it's terrible. Don't do what the Brit thing of speaking between the lines, because most of your team is not going to get it. And most of the issues in cross-cultural teams come down to miscommunication. So default to low context, that includes writing things down as much as possible. And now, there's amazing technology. Now you can literally have AI transcribe every single meeting and highlight the the takeaways or the action points. So it doesn't have to be a very heavy duty work in the way that it used to be even just a few years ago. Make asynchronous work possible, because obviously when you're talking cross-cultural, you're also talking cross time zones. So that's a really, really also essential element to success, is making asynchronous work possible, and autonomous work. Like you just got to trust. You just got to trust that you've hired smart people and they know what they're doing, partly because you can't tell, because you don't know that culture, you don't know that market as well. So unless you're in a business that has like very clear measurable outputs and you can tell whether it works or not, which unfortunately in media, not that easy, you just got to trust that they know what they're doing and that they're working. I just find generally in management, like, be picky with who you hire, but like trust them, because nobody wants a micromanager. And then travel budgets is my last thing.
Okay.
You got to have face-to-face time. You got to know people as human beings. I know like everyone is like, Zoom is amazing. And yeah, Zoom is amazing, but it cannot replace everything. I was really lucky when I joined, so I joined LinkedIn in 2012. We were only like 4 or 5 people at the time. I wasn't a manager yet, but I started out in Paris, and my boss was in New York. My boss was in New York the entire time. And I was in Paris, and then I was in Sydney, Australia, and then I finished in London. And from the day I was hired, the rule was I get to go to New York once a quarter. And so for like 7-8 years, I saw my boss in person, 3, 4, 5 times a year, depending. And I also saw people on my team. Now, obviously, as the team got bigger, did it a little bit less because it got expensive. But you got to have a travel budget. You got to have at least a yearly offsite where the entire team gets together, because like no one likes spending their entire time behind a computer. You need to be able to just have human interactions. It's not just about the work. It's just about knowing people as humans. And that just like makes a massive difference.
Yeah, so again, I think what's interesting is all these things I think make for good management in general. So, very clear communication, spelling things out as much as possible, acknowledging differences in context, and meeting face to face whenever possible. But it, again, as you say, that's kind of up a notch because we're further away geographically or in our backgrounds. And I really loved the celebration part of this and your example of candy. I wish we could exchange our favorite candy of a Zoom. The equivalent
recipes or something. I don't know.
You all saying where you're from kind of brings a smile to my face as well. Kind of like feeling that you're all around the world in your time zones makes us feel connected. So that's my small version of celebrating on this event. Okay. Now I want to move past this let's call it the candy phase. I was about to call it the phase where you're all happy, exchanging our favorite candy, and we all meet. We have a great, generous travel budget. We can all meet and feel like we really know each other deeply. Right? Let's imagine we bump into big challenges. What would be the typical issues that you suggest we watch out for? And what can we do to diffuse those? If you have examples from your own experience, that would be great.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of them come down to miscommunication. So we just kind of, we touched on that, but yeah, it's just things get lost in translation, things get lost in the many emails, or people interpret something based on their culture. So a funny example, which is actually, again, kind of related to, high context, low context. And I used to have a French team members. People hated her emails. Like, people got really mad about her emails. And I read a book, which I'll recommend later, which is kind of the Bible for this stuff. And there were 2 pages there about French people's email that just opened my eyes, because it wasn't her, it was our culture, and it hadn't occurred to me because it's transparent to me because I am French and I am American, British, whatever else I am. So the way French people explain things, and I'm doing it right now, is you start with a theory. And then you get to the specific, the example. I mean, that's how we're taught to write essays in school. Start with a general, start with a theory, and then, illustrate with an example. And so in business emails, it translates to, I want to explain to you in 2 really long paragraphs, like all the reasons why. And then at the end, here's the action that you need to take. But that amount of context, an American reads the email and it's like, why the hell are there like 3 insanely long paragraphs? The only thing I'm interested in is the action point at the end. And does she think that I'm stupid, that I don't know all that context, which I do know because we work for the same company and, the same project or whatever. And people would genuinely be really, really mad. And I ended up taking that book, scanning the 2 pages on French emails and sending them to the French team member and being like, just so you know, this is how people read your emails. So, maybe think about how you can communicate them to differently to an American audience. I could have done the opposite and sent to the American audience and be like, give her a break. This is how she communicates. You all need to adapt. Unfortunately, we're working for an American company, and it's easier to deal with the one person than to deal with 200 people on the other end of that email, which is also actually a point of cross-cultural management. You just have to be aware that if you're in the minority, if you're working for an American company, you're always going to have to more or less adopt American norms. You might be lucky and, have some people on the other side who have that self-awareness and adapt a little bit. But it's really hard when you're 80% of the company to, that's the issue of every minority the world over. So unfortunately, it does end up being there's more of the minority that has to adapt. People who work for French company or Japanese company, I'm sure, are encountering the same thing. So communication, again, I think humility just matters so much. We had a saying, I think it came from Ryan Roslansky, who was my boss's boss. He's now the CEO of LinkedIn. And he always said, assume good intentions. And it just became a motto. I think, it's still written somewhere on my wall. It's still a thing that I remind myself of every day. And that really became like a leitmotif, a motto within the company, which is when you get that email that annoys you, when somebody does something at work that like you can't believe they did that, assume good intentions, because it's a friendly company, everyone is on the same team, we're all working towards the same goals. Odds are you're misunderstanding what's happening here, or or they didn't realize that what they were doing was a problem for you. And so you start by, it doesn't mean like be naive, but you start by assuming good intentions. Also, if it's more than 3 emails, it should be a phone call. We had some of these roles that just like, all of these things are just roles that help with miscommunication, which happens a lot. And then the final challenge, and that's something that honestly I didn't solve to my full satisfaction when I was a cross-cultural manager, is when you have performance issues, is differentiating the performance of your employee from the realities of the market that they operate in. So, are things not taken off in Japan because your Japan team leader is just not up to snuff? Or is the market in Japan just really different and really complicated? And the techniques that have worked when you launched it in America, when you launched it in Germany, actually Germany was also a nightmare of a market. They don't work. And that is really hard to tell when you don't have the knowledge of that particular environment. And I wish I could say I always make the right decision about, who to question their performance and not. And I don't think I always did. It's a really hard one.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I can imagine how delicate that is. And as a manager directly, when you have to actually give your end of year review or whatever format it is, how do you factor that culture in and assume the best from the person, assume good intentions, but also be realistic about performance?
Yeah.
I also really like these examples of the emails, because I think we can all relate to this kind of low level irritation when you get that email, you're like, oh, that's a bit odd, and then you kind of get that from different people at different times, and it kind of can grow into something quite big if you don't tackle it as you did with like a quick explanation. Or
I had another one like that in China, and that was also really interesting, where I was trying to brainstorm ideas for God knows what project, I forget, with my Chinese team, and we just weren't getting anywhere, and I was just getting really frustrated because people were not volunteering ideas, and it just wasn't creative. It wasn't what a brainstorm is supposed to be. And then I have to give credit to my Chinese direct report, who explained it to me after. Who's like, look, I don't think this is going to work for us, because it's a more hierarchical culture than what I'm used to. And so the team members, so it was a multi-level team meeting, and the team members weren't going to talk to me over their manager who was in the room. and they were never going to disagree publicly in front of me. So I had to remove myself from that situation and let them have their own like brainstorm in their corner and disagree with between them and come to a consensus between them, and then come to me with something that they could all agree on. Which, you know, as like democratic and like flat hierarchy as I'm thinking, and I just, you know, I don't think it's a problem that I'm in the room, because you're all, I mean, yeah, they're management, you know, levels, but whatever, we're all teammates. Like I'm not, I don't care about titles. But they did. And so, you know, that was a case of humbling me, of being like, oh, I misread that situation. And they were perfectly capable of being creative and of having ideas. It's just I didn't create the environment that would foster that. So I had to rethink the environment.
Right. So it's going back to that humility piece of really removing yourself from a situation to make sure that they feel psychologically safe to come up with ideas and make mistakes.
And creating that environment where they can even tell you, like, hey, you got that one wrong.
Yeah,
you know, which, you know, also requires like just humility and just a lot of, hey guys, like, you know, I'm not the source of all truth here. Challenge me. But there are a lot of cultures where it's challenging their bosses is not okay, you know, including France, you know, but I've been so Americanized that I just take it for granted sometimes.
Good reminder. Thank you. So I have more questions, but I want to remind you all again, people who are listening from Canada, Senegal, and all over the US, that you can put your questions into the Q&A box or the webinar chat, and we'll answer them in a little bit. I want to go back to some of the things you've already mentioned, the challenges of multilingualism in particular. You mentioned good communication as one of the keys, but do you have any particular practical advice to communicate with team members who have different native languages, whether it's meetings, writing?
Talk slow, which I'm terrible at doing, reminding myself of. Hopefully everyone here is a first language English speaker or fluent enough, but talking slower matters. You can really tell the difference between like a meeting where everyone is a second language speaker, like it's in English, but everyone is coming at English as a foreign speaker, versus, you know, a meeting room full of Americans or full of Brits or Canadians, and, you know, just a handful of foreigners who have to keep up. You know, there is a certain level, let's be honest, of, you know, if you're hiring people who are going to be working constantly, you know, within an English language context, you know, you just hire people at a certain level of English, because I mean, it's just how we work. You know, I've done interviews. It's horrible. I've done interviews with people where, you know, they had an accent that was so strong that I struggled to understand them. And I'm someone who's like lived in a bunch of different countries, and you know, I'm used to making a lot of allowances and a lot of room for different language levels. But when you get to a point that you can't communicate effectively, they're not the right person for the role. You know, it's not a diss against them. It's just not going to work. But that said, when you do have the right people in the room, avoid jargon, and kind of those, you know, idioms and expressions, you know, that are not necessarily understandable. Or if you use them, just get used to translating. You know, you'll say something and be like, which, by the way, you know, means so and so. If you're going to use a jargon acronym, whatever, make sure to spell it out, which, by the way, is true for, you know, even, you know, within the same culture, because every company has their own jargon. And when you first join, I mean, LinkedIn was my first and only really corporate job. I came from newsrooms. Now the jargon of newsrooms is a whole other planet. And then I get to the corporate world, and there's all these acronyms and like things that I'd never heard, you know, and it takes a little while. So it's just generally a good idea to be inclusive and welcoming of new staff and foreign staff and visitors, to try and reduce the jargon. And then just like give people a break, give people maybe a little bit more time. You know, if someone has to write a complex email, write a memo, and they're doing that in their second or their third or their fourth language. You know, if you go to India, everyone speaks 3 languages before they even get to school, you know. Give them a break. That's going to take them longer to put together than it takes you. And then, you know, I like, finally a comment. The alphabet soup is acronym. Yeah, it's really hard. And yes, I'm with you. And then, yeah, so someone has to, you know, create a document, write a strategy, do an email, participate in all hands. You know, I was just always in awe of people. You have a company all hands. There's like 5,000 people watching and your CEO in the room. And you have to explain like a complex business thing, and you have to do it in a foreign language. I mean, I'm always reminded of that GIF. Is Sofia Vergara, I think in like Modern Family or one of those American sitcoms, is like, do you know how smart I am in Spanish? And that's the thing, right? You're not, you just have to realize you're not getting like the highest level of that person, because yeah, everything that's going on in their mind, they may not be able to express that, to translate that to you with quite as much nuance and detail. So like give them a little bit more time to write that email, you know, prepare that presentation, and also be mindful of just how tough and how like nerve-wracking it is to put yourself out there in another language, especially in cultures where making a mistake is a kind of losing face. You know, there are people who just throw themselves out there and they speak with a horrid accent and they make grammar mistakes all the time, and they don't really care because they're getting their points across. And I applaud them. But if you've grown up in a French school system, making a single mistake is like the worst thing you could possibly do, and it's better for you to shut up. Like that's the way that we were taught. And so, you know, I took 12 years of German, and you will still not hear me speak German because I'm sure I will make a mistake somewhere and I don't want to. And so, you know, and there are a lot of people for whom that's the case, and they still have to do it at work every day. And I just tip my hat to them. And so, yeah, just like acknowledge that.
Thank you for those very practical examples. I can tell this come from experience.
Lots and lots of experience. Yeah. And I didn't always speak English like this, you know. When you first learn a foreign language, my first 3 months of living in America, I had the most massive migraine every day at the end of the day, because I was in high school at the time, and just following conversations in English all day long is so exhausting. So imagine how your foreign or non-English speaking colleagues must feel at the end of the day. Like the headache is real.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I've asked you all the most important questions I had for you. Now's your chance to ask questions in the chat box. And we have Isabel for another 10 minutes, so we can ask her as much as possible. In the meantime, while everybody's thinking of questions, maybe from their own experience with their own teams, some difficulties they've had to deal with. We've mentioned so many different things: awareness, humility, assuming good intentions. And we've mentioned some really important big ideas, but if you just have to take one idea away from this, which one would you highlight?
Humility. I think it's just like, just know how much you don't know, and respect where others are coming from. And then if you don't know, ask. And it applies to others, right? Like create the room where they can ask. And I think a lot of that can be dispelled through like humble communication.
Yeah, this idea of feeling psychologically safe in the room.
Yeah, exactly. Just making room for everyone to acknowledge like the distance between us in terms of cultural understanding, and then finding ways to gap that distance.
And you've also mentioned the book with the 2 pages on French emails.
Yes,
that I'm
gonna grab it. It's like right here next.
I'm here for all your references of podcasts, articles, books, or anything you want.
Is literally right here in my bookshelf. So I grabbed it. It's if you can see, there's the blurry. It's the culture map by Aaron Meyer. So it's funny, it's a book that the CEO of Netflix loved and recommended to the CEO, loved it so much that Aaron co-wrote his book later on. But anyway, CEO of Netflix loved that book, Reed Hastings, recommended it to the CEO of LinkedIn, Jeff Weiner at the time, who then recommended it to his direct reports, who recommended it to their direct reports, and the book just like traveled like wildfire. And now I recommend it to everyone. Aaron is professor at INSEAD, the French business school, and so she is coming from that background herself of being an American who lives in France, and is essentially a book about navigating those cultural differences. And she has 8 different categories where you can like rank countries. And it's not like, this country is high context, so this country is low context. It's like, is it more or is it higher or lower context in the country that you're from is what matters. And so she has this kind of like scale where you can like map a country on these different items, and it tells you, it helps you kind of think about how you're going to communicate and manage people from those countries. So and like, stop me if a question comes in, but if not, I'll go through them. The 8 things are communicating, so low context to high context; evaluating, so direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback. How you give feedback to people is super important. Persuading, principles first versus applications first. That's what I was telling you about the French emails. You get through all the theory first. Leading, egalitarian versus hierarchical. That Chinese example I was giving you. Deciding, consensual versus top-down. Trusting, task-based versus relationship-based. So how much time you spend really knowing someone before you do work with them. Disagreeing or confrontational versus avoiding confrontation. And the last one is on scheduling, linear time versus flexible time. People showing up on time for meetings or being French and 15 minutes politely late to everything. And so it's fascinating. It's really interesting to read, particularly the first 2 chapters, if you only read 2, which are on communicating and on giving feedback, which really helped me with thinking about my performance reviews, for instance. And the other thing that's great on her website is that you can literally, if you Google Aaron Meyer culture map, you'll find her website, and you can literally create a map with like, take your team and all the countries that you're working with and create a map like custom for your team of like where you sit compared to on these different criteria. So yeah, found it really great. I found it a really interesting read.
I've shared the website in the chat.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating, because that sounds like a good mix of theory and practice.
Yeah, and it's very much based on research. There's one thing that I'm sorry that I didn't say that I wrote in my notes, and that I think really matters. And then I've got more book recommendations, but we talked a lot about cultural differences like between countries. And as much as I spent the last hour talking about them, I do want to warn against over-indexing on cultural differences, because we acknowledge the diversity of individual experiences within our own culture, but then we look abroad and we tend to say, oh, all Germans are like this, all French people like this, all Japanese people are like that. They have just as much diversity as your own culture. There is just as much, variation between regions, between individual families, between individuals. And so you can't put everything on culture. Sometimes it's just personality. Sometimes it's just, it's just who someone is. And I'm French, and I may have a lot more in common with my friend from Lebanon than I do with someone down the street from me in France, you know?
Mm.
So it's just, culture is great and it's something that we need to understand, but it's not everything. And ultimately it's the person that you work with that you have to know.
Mm.
Um,
Thank you. Thank you for adding this, because it's true that it's really important. We've made some generalizations, and there's even some funny element to that sometimes, that, oh, you know, like the French already arrive late at meetings and
yeah,
stuff. There is an element of truth to that, and there's also an element of lumping, sweeping generalizations
yeah,
that you brought this up. I'm really
yeah,
glad. I wanted to acknowledge Beer in the chat, who seems to have had
yeah.
mentioned some examples
That's
of
rough.
how important it is as an Asian American to tend and care to our elders in the family, and that managers might not always be aware of this. I think it was more of a comment, a statement, but
Yeah.
it's a good example, I think, of some things that might be going on for someone personally that might not be an issue for you, and not something that you
Yeah.
even think about as a manager from
Yeah.
another.
And I appreciate you sharing, because it's in those you know, personal situations where, you know, you're very vulnerable, that it can hurt you even more when somebody doesn't understand where you're coming from, because like you're in a moment where you're really raw and you wish you would have the support of your company, and that they don't get that. Like it sucks. Yeah, I had a similar experience where my aunt was sick, and I took more days than I normally would have of traveling and just working from home. I was still working, but I was just a little bit less into it, you know, and a little bit less available, because literally my aunt was dying. And yeah, I got some comments from Americans. They were like, "Oh, you're taking a day again." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sorry, they're not dying faster. Like, what do you think happens?" You know, um, and uh, and yeah, it can be a case. And sometimes it's not just cultural; it's people being a bit of a jerk. But
Mhm.
I'm sorry
Okay.
you're having that experience.
Yeah. Okay, that's all we have time for. In addition to the recommendation you shared, the book, The Culture Gap, I also want to recommend to everybody here to go and subscribe to, to check out first the existing content you have on your website, because there's quite a lot of, there are more than 50 in-depth interviews on her podcast, Borderline, that I really liked, which explores lives lived across borders, immigration, globalization. You can find that podcast at isabellerugol.com. And I will put it in the chat, because that's
I'll
not
put it in the chat just now.
yeah. And also, if you happen to work in media, you can sign up to Isabel's upcoming newsletter called The Lead, which is about building sustainable media organizations where people love to work. So thank you so much, Isabel, for your time and your insights and your anecdotes and examples. I think a lot of people could relate to them, and I hope you will all get some both theoretical and practical ideas to apply in your organizations. You will. Thank you
Go ahead,
again.
sorry.
No, and thank you everyone who joined from far away and from from, I haven't counted the locations, but it's really good to feel you all coming from different time zones. You will soon get an email with a link to the recording, so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. And you will also receive information about the next webinar and get a chance to register for our next one. Thanks again, Isabel. Thanks to all of you for your attention, and have a great rest of the week. Bye.
Thanks everyone for listening.